you for joining us for our ESG webinar series. Today's topic will focus on how using data can help you identify systemic and structural issues within your organization that create barriers to greater equity, diversity, and inclusion. Well, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Mike College, President of Ipsos Canada's Public Affairs Practice. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Grace and Olivia. Just quick introductions: Grace Tong, who heads up Ipsos, our DEI practice and lead, and Olivia Nuema, who is the PwC DEI lead. I'm going to steal a few minutes of your time before you guys start, just to tell everybody a little bit more about today's webinar in the series. We are doing this as part of a webinar series on ESG. For those who haven't listened in on other ones that we started a couple weeks ago, Sean Simpson and Megan Miller from our corporate reputation team did a presentation on how organizations can use their ESG actions and their KPIs and their achievements to their advantage to improve their corporate reputations, build trust, etc. After that, we had Ted Doring, who leads our Creative Excellence group. He did a great session on the role of sustainability in advertising, offered some best practices on how everybody can do better and achieve their goals. And after that, we had Robin Seed, who heads up our online communities, who gives some really good insights through a newcomers community that we have set up about both the challenges that newcomers are facing in Canada, but also the opportunities for marketers and for service providers in reaching and how to reach out to that community. And then just last week, Dion Daly from our innovation service line discussed the role of sustainable packaging and really how it's possible to help the planet, improve your sustainability packaging, yet still remain sort of a unique and distinctive brand in the market through your packaging. So with that, gives you an idea of the range of things we've talked about, and I'm super interested in and looking forward to hearing what Grace and Olivia have to say today and walk us through some very cool groundbreaking work they've done on DEI. So I'll pass it over to you, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. We're really excited to be here today to present in this webinar. We welcome Olivia Nuema from PwC, whom I've worked with for 3 years. Very excited to present some of the results from the work that we've done to you this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing some of your questions, but if I don't get to it by the end, we will definitely reach out to you after as well. So first, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit, and then I'll pass it over to Olivia to introduce herself, and she will start off the webinar. And then I will continue with a little bit more soon after that, as I am trying to. Okay, there we go. So I'm a Vice President in Public Affairs Research at Ipsos Canada. I'm also the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Practice Lead. Much of my work in my career is focused on social research and understanding people's behaviors and patterns in societies. My first work in diversity was actually over 15 years ago. The very first project I worked on, fresh out of school, was actually on behalf of the Cultural Diversity Task Force on Canadian television. And it really very much started my career path that has led to the work that I do now, and ultimately to the work that we are presenting today. So we welcome Olivia Nuema. Very excited to present this research with her, and I will hand over to you, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Grace, and it's lovely to be here and lovely to be having this conversation with you. My name is Olivia Nuema, and as the slide says, I'm the National Inclusion, Diversity, and Belonging Leader at PwC, and I, before now, have had as with Grace, a long career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in Canada and in the UK primarily, and the States. In particular, I guess I'm kind of known in the LGBTQ space when I used to run Pride Toronto, and before then in homelessness, poverty reduction, and generally in childcare. Next slide, please. Next slide. And so I'm here to kind of talk to you about the work that PwC Canada has done with Ipsos at looking at its culture and generally at trying to understand how to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. I started at PwC now about 2.5 years ago in the midst of COVID. And I guess I was brought in for a number of reasons. First, the sense that it was a business necessity to understand retention and to understand how to retain employees. Secondly, overall, we know that diversity and communities from a range of countries around the world are coming to Canada in order to, one, support our economy, but two, we know that our population will grow through immigration, particularly our highly specialized skills. And so certainly PwC saw a necessity to understand what the future might look like. And naturally, what COVID taught many organizations, including PwC, was that it was important that people felt they could, if you like, bring their authentic selves to work, which in other words, how to ensure that people were able to feel free to express themselves in how they liked, when they liked, in a place of safety. And the understanding that that was what was going to differentiate PwC overall was a part of the reason I was brought in. Of course, we could see societally there were a bunch of changes happening that organizations had to keep up with, but certainly every organization took a different approach. And what we're going to talk to you about is how PwC partnered with Ipsos to look at how we were going to develop some of these narratives to move the organization forward. Next slide, Grace. Next slide. And so what we thought we'd do certainly is encompass what PwC was trying to do. And really it was, we understood, and by we, I mean me, but a significant ethos of certainly the way that I do my own work is to do that from the ground up, is to do that from the people that occupy the space that you're trying to change, evolve, transform. And in that sense, this quote perfectly sums that up. A culture of empowerment fuels the flames of transformative change. Empowering employees to speak up, share their ideas, and actively participate in the shaping of their workforce culture is the cornerstone of driving meaningful and lasting cultural change. Meaningful being the most important thing. If people could see themselves reflected in any change that you would like to see, hopefully they would be more invested, and by being more invested, not only would that change be impactful, but it's change that you could sustain. Next slide. And so we did this taking, like I say, a ground up approach, but still wanted to be incredibly data driven. PwC is an accountancy firm. It's important that the way in which we presented our data was not only about what we knew people experienced, but also that it was grounded in evidence. And so in this case, we took both a quantitative and qualitative look. I'm going to talk much more about the qualitative look, but it definitely was grounded in understanding the data as it manifested at PwC. And so what we did was we undertook surveys. From those surveys, we undertook focus groups. What these focus groups were meant to do was not only validate some of the data that we collected in our surveys, but also we wanted to bring that evidence to life. And so we did that by chronicling a range of what I considered the archetypes at PwC, which ostensibly were the most dominant populations at the firm, and effectively tried to characterize their experience, not only using their own voices, but using the data as well. So we're going to focus on Jennifer. She's in her early 40s and married. She was born in Canada and is the mom of 2 children. Work and household is a balancing act, and she rarely lets her personal life bleed into her professional. She's a high achiever, and as a result is incredibly self-critical. Next slide. What we wanted to do was really separate how Jennifer saw herself from sometimes how as organizations we launder people's life life characteristics. And so how she saw herself and how the company see her. Next. So we had a real issue with what happened when Jennifer becomes a mother. And what would tend to happen, as anybody with children or starting a family or just having caregiving responsibilities in general, is often she would move meetings around and she would clean, which would, on the face of it, mean that she would seem distracted. Next. But what we wanted everybody to understand was that it didn't mean that she was disorganized or not prioritizing work. And this really mattered because one of the things we were trying to do was say out loud what people sometimes instinctively think but don't say. And what we wanted people to understand was that from Jennifer's perspective, she was actually managing her demands and managing them well. Next slide. Next. What we wanted people to understand is that if she wasn't available after 4, it didn't mean that she didn't care about work. In fact, how she saw herself was that not only was she doing less, but she was doing it better and doing it more effectively and more efficiently. Next slide. Next. We really wanted to drive at the issues around confidence. Often the narrative was that women felt less confident and less able to speak up for themselves. I kind of wanted to look at that differently. In other words, look at it as though if safe spaces were created that allowed everybody to feel able to contribute, women along with everybody else would feel able to positively contribute and do so without necessarily feeling as though they were taking up space unnecessarily. So we wanted to drive at that. If she does not talk about herself or her work confidently, it doesn't mean that the quality of her work has dipped. It could be that perceptions of her underperforming are actually undermining her confidence. And so again, we wanted to highlight this issue around how a workplace environment makes people feel, often how that contributes to a lack of performance. Next slide. And so when we partnered with Ipsos, we wanted to, like I say, underpin that lived experience with data. We actually started with the data in order to sort of highlight the areas that we wanted to look at. And one of the areas we wanted to look at was what happened, how many women came into the organization and what happened as their careers progressed. And what this simply shows you is that more women entered in positions, more women entered at entry level than rose through their careers. And when we compared that to that of men, what we saw was that less of them entered and their career trajectory tended to increase substantively more over time. Next slide. The interesting thing about the difference between these two slides is that one of the underpinning narratives here is that we also allied this with looking at performance data. And what we soon came to know was that women at the firm actually outperformed their male counterparts. So they came in, they tended to stay in role longer, they tended to be more skilled over time, they outperformed, and yet their careers didn't progress. And as this slide indicates, they also made 6 cents less on the dollar than their male counterpart. Next slide. And so I think one of the brave things that PwC did was decide that they were going to, instead of visioning on high what good looked like and asking everybody to attain that, what we said was what we were going to do was attempt to build trust by being transparent. So all of that data that we've just gone through, every year, we effectively report that data out to the whole firm. So all approximately 8,000 employees ultimately hear exactly how by identity they fare year on year in performance, in pay, and in career progression. And the idea was that if we were able to arm people with the tools to understand where they sat in relation to everybody else, then they would do a better job of advocating for themselves in ways that worked for them, which is exactly what proceeded to happen. So for every one of, and that's all of our demographics, and I'm talking about women here, but actually one of the things we also really want to make clear is that we also understood the characteristics as they applied to men, and as they applied to men who were starting young families, as they apply to men who were disabled. So we also understood in terms of our, the issue around our equities, that depending on what the issue was, everybody was negatively impacted in one way or another. So we just drove at those negative impacts, and we promised that we would be transparent, which is what we've done for the last 2 years. Next slide. And so over time, what we started to see was that we needed to look specifically at the areas that not only people were telling us, but the data was telling us was incredibly problematic. So one of those was, as we looked at our pay gap, we came to understand that more women took parental leave. The result of taking a parental leave was that they were paid less because their performance review would not reflect the nature of their talent, but would actually reflect that in relation to the amount of time that they had spent on the job, regardless of what that reasoning was. And we saw that as a negative. And in fact, both men and women were negatively impacted. So what we did was say, okay, we will look at not only understanding the negative impacts of parental leave, but we will also look at a coaching program and a leave pledge around not only workplace culture, safety, leadership development, et cetera, but we would also ensure that if anybody was off leave or on leave as a result of starting a family, that we would then ensure that they were coached, and then we would ensure that they were transitioned back onto the job in a way that made sense for them. Next. We introduced a new way of looking at how we performance reviewed people, whereas again, based on being on the job, you generally not only time on job, but hours and skill was reviewed. We suggested that in fact, this way of thinking about looking at somebody's skills and abilities negatively impacted certainly women. And so what we wanted to do was understand how we could change that, and we changed that quite dramatically. Next. We introduced a leave policy, and effectively what this for PwC meant was that often when you took a leave, you were negatively impacted in one way or another. What we said was, in fact, if you take a leave, how you were reviewed before your leave remained when you returned, so that you weren't being negatively impacted. And again, this tended to largely impact women who tended to take not only parental leave, but also caregiver leave and short and long-term disability. And so it was necessary to look at this as an equalizer. Continuous DEI upskilling. So a part of the partnership we have with Ipsos is that we do this yearly now. We have a yearly look at where the gaps are, and we're continually looking at our processes as a result of what springs up. Next. Some of the most impactful work that Ipsos has done with us is their pay gap analysis work, which Grace will talk about, but ultimately it has led to many conversations internally for us around how we look at pay. And in fact, we do publicize our pay data now annually, or this is the first time we will be doing it. And again, we're doing it with a view to not only ensuring that people understand where they sit on a hierarchy in relation to compensation, but we also do publish this number in the market to again try to sort of start to redefine what trust looks like with organizations like PwC, both internally and externally. Next. And one of, and this was, maybe coincidental, maybe not, but obviously we are a part of a global network of firms. One of the global directions PwC has taken is to redefine leadership and to do so in a way that's focused on behaviors. We understand organizations have matured somewhat in relation to understanding targeting and understanding what it means to, and of course legislation underpins that. What we also want to do now is underpin that with the behaviors that ensure that even if you have a bunch of the right people in role, that they are experiencing a workplace that allows them to grow to their own potential. Because ultimately we understand that if that experience doesn't exist, then often with certainly the groups we're speaking about, it leads to de-skilling and it tends to lead to dropping out of the workforce. This is what we saw with COVID, and this is what we're kind of trying to underpin, especially at an organization that's focused on people and is focused on delivering intellectual property in a way that works for organizations. It's important that people feel valued, supported, and included. And so a part of that is making sure that behaviors align with aspirations. Next. Next. So some of what we've seen over now, this will be the third year that Ipsos are doing this work with us. We've seen in terms of motivation, we've seen a 5-point increase in terms of retention and a 6-point increase in terms of motivation. This is people's intent to stay and people feeling motivated to continue their career at PwC. We've seen positive shifts in those areas. Next. And what was really pleasing, not to say that the work that we've done here is entirely the reason why our profit margins look the way they did, but what we do want to say is that what we see is that this work is not in any way a negative. We see that if things are moving in the right direction, this work can underpin the growth of that movement. It can underpin momentum. And as we've seen, I mean, pre-COVID, many organizations are feeling this sort of the steady stream of employees no longer sort of walking out the door. But what we are trying to understand is how to increase satisfaction levels in the light of that in order that we can increase productivity. And we do believe that a part of the cultural shift has definitely led to a greater sense of belonging, and as a result led to a greater sense of output and more meaning. Next slide. And so some of the changes that we've seen is that last year, or it was announced this year, we won the LinkedIn Talent Awards as a diversity champion. Next. And Open Minds is a piece of work that's existed at the firm for a while. It is both, it's a part of PwC US, but we also transported it to Canada, and it has won several awards in relation to just putting PwC in a position to truly understand the DEI upskilling journey. And it's done that in a way that has seen it get some accolades. We've also developed a proprietary training tool called In Your Shoes, which is virtual reality, and does an incredibly good job of creating empathy in terms of placing you in the position of somebody not like you. Next. We recently, as a result of focusing on groups of people who are experiencing the greatest degrees of disadvantage, our Black members of staff are the ones that leave at the highest rate in our sort of lower and middle management levels. And so we've developed a Amplifying Black Leaders program in an attempt to sort of try to understand how we can better support this group. Next. And as I mentioned, we've developed, we partnered with an organization called Parentally, who offers parental leave coaching and training for managers on site in an attempt to try to make the experience of those who are starting families a little bit more welcoming and supportive, as we were consistently hearing that this was a weak area for us as an organization. And so we have seen incredible benefits, not only from its introduction, but one of the most pleasing benefits we've seen is that we're now starting to see a steady uptick in men taking parental leave, which was, less so the case before we went hard on the messaging and the support for people who are looking at starting families. Next. I think it's you, Grace.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Olivia. I think I speak on behalf of my colleagues as well that this has truly been very inspirational to work with you over the last 3 years, and we're excited to see a lot of the actions that have taken place as a result of the data and the results and the insights that have come from that. What I would like to do next is take you through some of the process and what we have done to help PwC support them in their data collection strategy. We helped them form a research platform over the last 3 years, and we continue to evolve. We continue to create new and innovative approaches as we go, as the data speaks to us. We also helped PwC amplify the experiences and the voices of their employees by helping to socialize the results through the organization. So one of the key things that came as a result of the early research that we did 2 years ago was we helped define the question, tell me why I matter. And it was a key question that employees started asking once they started seeing themselves reflected in the data. And really what we saw was the power of data in action. So I aim today to take you through how data can be used and how the power of storytelling to help shape individual career paths and can help influence cultural transformation within an organization. And really, I think the key is that I think Olivia has taken you through is not just looking at the data and looking at the issues and the problems, but actually finding ways to take action with that data so that employees see the loop start to close. And it is evolving. There's no end, as you know, in DEI. But as populations, as society changes, we continually keep looking at the data. Ultimately, I think what I'll do is just take you through next. What did we do? It really was a very collaborative approach, working with Olivia and her team over the last 2.5 years. We started off looking at survey data, but let me take you back one step. Actually, there's actually to truly dig into the structural and the systemic issues around DEI. An organization should approach or must approach the problem from 2 different directions. One is gathering data about perceptions, and the other is digging into systems data. And the 2 together really tell a full story. And the 2 together can really help make structural and systemic change, which is really where an organization wants to be. So one of the first things we did was the quantitative survey. It was simply a 10-minute survey where we started out with 3 questions, a census survey. What is the representation within the workforce? Are there gaps in representation within the organization? And if yes, across which levels and among which identity groups? The second question that we posed in this first research round was, to what extent do issues around DEI exist within the organization? And if these issues do exist, in what ways and among which groups? And we quantified that. Third question that drove our research was, Do factors around inclusion and equity contribute to retention issues? So remember, 2.5 years ago, there were issues around retention. And within PwC, one of the big issues was around women, very experienced and tenured women within the organization leading, as well as people of color in the more junior levels. So we went in trying to understand what were the factors that were driving this attrition. The survey results ultimately gave us this representation data. And I should note that initially the organization tried to collect this identity information internally. But I don't think at that time there was a full understanding of how that data was used and a full trust in how that data would be used. So we ended up doing that collection of the data, and we garnered about a 60 to 65% response rate, and we were able to use that data to look at survey perceptions as well. And ultimately, over time, the next year, when PwC started collecting that identity data internally, it went up to almost 80%. So when employees saw how data was collected and why it was collected, they then trusted the process of collection. And I think that was a really important step in the process itself. So the survey results gave us a sense of what really mattered. Tell me why I matter. And also identified which identity groups were feeling like they were left behind. So we focused on women here, but really we're also looking at people of color, looking at caregivers, parents, those living with disabilities, those identifying as LGBTQ2S+, and also the intersectionalities within those groups as well. The next stage of the process was looking at the data in a much deeper way. We used Ipsos Bayes-Net predictive modeling. It's a proprietary tool, and I will tell you a little bit about it in the next couple of slides. But what it did was it really helped us to provide strategic direction on where to take action on DEI within PwC as an organization. And third, in terms of perceptions data, and arguably I think the most important part of the research, we do need to quantify, obviously, and track trends over time, but to really get a sense of how employees are feeling within the organization, you must do qualitative. And we do qualitative every year. In the first year, we did portraits, we did employee journeys to really understand some of the pain points in employees' experiences at different levels and within different functional areas across the organization. Because even within different functional areas or lines of service, there's different subcultures. So you want to understand that as well. This year, we did some qualitative this past summer, and we've developed and informed a coaching guide for PwC to take forward. In terms of systems data, we did look at a number of different ways, and this is just, excuse me, I lost my mouse. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, found my mouse again. Apologies for that. So we did look at the systems data in a number of different ways. The first is, in the first year, we looked at performance evaluations, and we really wanted to understand whether or not there may be biases that are coming to light within the performance evaluations analysis. We then looked at pay gap. We actually proposed looking at pay gap analysis in the first year, but I think it was early in the process, and it is a journey with organizations. You know, you don't want to do everything at once. You want to look at one stage at a time. So the pay gap analysis came the following year when the organization, I think, felt there was a need to really fully look into it and understood our ability and capacity to do so. And there we saw an earlier data point, which is that women earn 96 cents on the dollar of men who are the dominant group. And we looked at it both in terms of the ratio, and then we also looked at using predictive modeling as well, the adjusted model, where we control for different factors. And in fact, we looked at 13 different factors in the model itself. And when controlling, we still found that women were earning less on the whole. The third part of it, and this was actually a separate part of analysis, but what we did was we linked all the data. We looked at performance analysis, pay gap, leaves of absence analysis, as well as the survey data and the qualitative data to tell a full story. But initially, PwC came to us and said, can you look at our data on leaves of absence? Because we're really interested. It's a separate piece of work that we're doing. And we did. But again, we linked it to tell a more fuller story of employees' experiences within the organization. So again, looking at both perceptions data and systems data, it's a much fuller story to address both structural and cultural organizational issues, but also system issues that are deeply embedded within policies and processes that you may not even be aware of within the organization, because we simply just live and breathe it. But when you dig in deep, you can actually identify it, and the organization can then take it away and look deeper under their hood to identify how they can make some change. So underlying all this, I think, is trust. Trust between us as the researchers and the organization, trust between the employees and the organization, and trust between the employees and us as the research organization. I think ultimately over the past 3 years, we've developed a high level of trust where not only did we survey and share the data, but also we have done pay gap analysis where PwC has actually shared their pay data with us as a research organization. So let me take you through a few of the key insights. So I mentioned earlier about the Ipsos Bayes-Net predictive modeling. What this does is actually understand how the drivers affect the outcome variable. So in this particular case, retention was our outcome variable. It was the question of that first year. How can we retain employees within the organization? And we developed questions that we inserted into a model as inputs to understand how they related to the outcome. So this model in the first year, 2021, revealed that sense of belonging was the single largest driver to retention. And you can see this chart. It was in fact the third largest driver that was 2 times larger than the next largest driver, as you can see here. And just to give you some context, competitive salary is actually third on this chart in terms of a retention driver. So that first output from the IBN, Ipsos Bayes-Net analysis, is really looking at the magnitude of the drivers. This next output from the drivers analysis shows you the relationship between the drivers themselves and their relationship and pathway to the retention outcome variable. So here we have retention as our outcome variable. And it is a very simplified map, by the way. Normally we put in anywhere from 20 to 25 inputs. It's a maximum number of inputs. And you get a very large, what some clients call a spider map. And we show you the pathways that affect the outcome variable, but we simplified it here for you, just for the sake of this presentation. The 3 direct drivers. So these are the 3 direct drivers that can impact retention. We spoke about sense of belonging. You can see the size of the bubble indicates it is the single largest driver there. But the 2 other direct drivers were trust in the organization to be fair, so equity, and the ability to set boundaries between work and life. And of course, 2 years ago, this was a very important factor in terms of retention. And I think moving into this year, it's also looking into remote work as well, because we also hear about how returning to work is impacting people staying in their jobs too. So it's an important question in this year. So we talk about relationship of variables to each other as they relate to the outcome variable. A key question that people asked us early on, well, what does a sense of belonging actually mean? So this model can actually help you unpack it. You can see here the different dimensions of psychological safety and how they relate to sense of belonging. For women, it's a feeling safe to be their authentic self within the organization, having open conversations on the team, being safe to discuss topics that impact their lives, whether it be children or family. And also another variable is comfortable speaking up to voice my opinions on my team. So it's really these particular aspects that relate to sense of belonging for women. And it's important to note that the drivers of retention differ by identity groups. So we also looked at that as well. We looked at people of color, we looked at women of color, we also looked at different management levels within the organization as well. So we spoke about qualitative research that we did in the first year. And that methodology was actually using an online community hubs methodology where people can be completely anonymous. We asked a set of questions, people responded, they could interact, they could also ask questions privately as well. And we kept this open for 3 to 5 days. And we did it, we looked at the data by different cuts. But here is just one quote from that early session of qualitative. I feel like my performance season always lets me down. I know that race and gender play a part in my performance, and it is so frustrating. I think, early on we looked at performance evaluations, but we also heard in the qualitative that there may have been bias in how people were being evaluated. So this early qual revealed both structural and systemic changes were needed within the organization, which then drove further analysis that we did down the road. So another quote, and now in 2023, this is from the recent qualitative work that we just did in August, 2 years later. You can see that there's unity in purpose and momentum and a direction and a congruence in the culture of the organization reflected in this quote. You'll find, even though we might be different in certain areas, but at the end of the day, we're very similar. We've all shared the same challenges and are working towards similar goals here. You can see how the power of data has created momentum within the organization to see each other as people that we are working with and to recognize our differences and to respect those differences. So just coming back to Jennifer, and she is our archetype that we bring to life in this particular presentation. If we look at all the Jennifers, or if we look at all the other archetypes who may reflect the different identity groups, if these Jennifers feel understood and they feel a sense of inclusion and belonging, they will truly be inspired to thrive within the organization. They will do their best within the organization. And who benefits from that? The organization as a whole. And I think Olivia demonstrated how some of the actions that they've taken have benefited in some very positive outcomes over the last 2.5 years. It is a two-way street. Organizations need to see themselves and how they also must be adjusting themselves throughout as they see the data as well. So just to sum this up, I think different organizations are really sitting at different points on this DEI journey. We've had lots of conversations with DEI leads and HR leads and C-suite leads within the organization. There really are different stages on this process, and really every organization should start internally and look from the ground up and really start listening to employees, start quantifying what those employee perceptions are, and what does it really take for an organization to really start that journey and make things happen, take action. We think it takes an organization that's willing to be bold. And we literally heard the CEO in the first presentation say, I want bold. Let's take some bold actions on this data. And Olivia and I have had conversations, wow, some of this data is quite interesting, quite shocking. And the leadership was ready to hear it at that time. It takes an organization willing to take chances and to see the evidence for what it is, and to find things to address issues. Take action to address issues, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. It also requires intentional deep examination through listening. It requires responsible action to address systemic issues, and it requires sustained effort to continue listening and to continue taking action, because as society is not static, neither are organizations as well. So it's important to just keep listening and keep taking action as you go, as society and as organizations change. So I think that sums up our overall presentation. We would love to take a couple of questions. I see there are a number of questions that are coming in. It is now, I'm just checking the time, it is 3:46. Olivia, perhaps we can take one question and then we can answer the other questions via email after the presentation. We thank you everyone for taking part and for listening to this. We hope that you were able to be inspired and take away a few nuggets for your own organization as well. So one question that came in, Olivia, is how was it possible to get the buy-in from PwC's leadership as well as staff in terms of taking them on this journey?
One of the key reasons they, came on board was Ipsos, actually, when we decided to anonymize. So once we made the decision that we were going to use a third-party organization who was going to work with us to undertake a deep dive analysis and then think through what solutions look like, I think it made them feel a lot more secure. And so that's what I would say. I would say that a part of getting leadership buy-in is also taking the issue out of their hands so that they don't feel entirely responsible for offering a solution. And then the second part of leadership buy-in was also convincing them that they weren't asked to create an answer. They weren't asked to solve everybody's problems. In fact, the key was that they not solve anybody's problems and that they actually let us work together to collaborate on the kind of workplace we wanted to see. So once they were absolved of that responsibility, it was actually quite easy to get them to come on side.
That's great. Thank you so much, Olivia. We are very happy that you joined us in this conversation today. We are now a little bit over time, and I'd like again to thank the audience for joining us. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime with any questions that you might have. We'll also get back to you with the responses to your questions in the chat as well. Thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.